Grief demands self-reflection and openness to change. I found that it was easier said than done. On March 30th, 2021, my husband and I tested positive for COVID. Ironically, I was booked for my first vaccine, April 1st, 2021. This is how my journey with grief began. I appreciated Leonard's title of his presentation, I Am Not the Same Person. I feel that I am not the same person I was before COVID. After being diagnosed with COVID, the first thing I did was contact my family doctor to ensure we would be monitored. The second thing I did was I refer to as Dr. Google. I like to suggest to my clients to stay clear of Dr. Google. It can take you down a path that you may not have the expertise to understand, or in the moment, not have someone to review the information with. I should have followed my own advice. Dr. Google was not helpful. I felt intense fear. I became very anxious. I was scared for my life, and the silent tears began to flow. And I did not want to let my husband know how afraid I was for both of us. This is where the emotions and logic became muddled, mixed in a bag of chaos in my brain. Although I read quite a few articles from Google, the words that resonated with me were not positive: lack of lung capacity, cardiac damage, ICU, and death. The mind was buzzing with negativity and catastrophizing, but the body was exhausted. The unknown was the scariest part of this virus. The days were long and the nights were even longer. The depth of loneliness is indescribable, very dark, even though my husband was with me. The fear of hospitalization with no proven treatment with poor outcomes was terrifying. We had two choices: hospitalization or stay at home. So we decided to ride this out at home. The blessing of this, if you could call it a blessing, or maybe I should suggest that it's called gratitude, was that I have many colleagues and friends in healthcare profession. This support and guidance I received was invaluable and carried us through this challenging time. But later on, would realize how lucky we were to have this type of support, as our system struggled to assist patients as the numbers of cases increased and the hospitals were imploding with patients. We were all trying to figure out as individuals or as family units how to cope with a pandemic. How do we maneuver through this? How do we establish a routine to ensure safety of ourselves and our family? Trying to acknowledge what we have control over and recognize what we don't have control over. Trying to be optimistic and hopeful during a pandemic. How to creatively stay connected with people and to try to find space to calm our body and calm our systems down during a very stressful and unusual time. Now that I contracted COVID, how was I going to cope? How was this going to end? And what would my future look like? It was then I realized my journey with COVID was a parallel journey of my clients with chronic pain. We were encouraged to believe that it was the same trajectory as a common flu. In a couple of days, the worst would be over. I held on to that. That's where hope came into play. But as the days progressed and we were still very ill, doubt and fear crept in. Finally, after 2.5 weeks in bed, we got out of the house. We could barely walk. We were very weak. Our speech was slurred. Word recall was difficult. Cognition was poor. We struggled with brain fog. Energy was very low. Sleep was poor. We were anxious. We felt helpless. We experienced tightness around our chest and in the fear of unknown. How much longer was it going to take to get back to our old selves? After a couple of months of continual resting and very little progress in regaining my health pre-COVID and not being able to return to work, this was the time my thoughts became even darker. Grief can create havoc on one's health. I wasn't eating the right foods, my sleep was poor, and I struggled with frightening nightmares. My emotions were taking me on a constant roller coaster. I felt like my body was betraying me. But for me, the cost of contracting COVID was becoming more evident that this was life-changing. Then, when I was diagnosed with long-haul COVID, I was devastated. The title of long haul was a huge trigger. For me, the title indicated there was no hope, no reason to believe I could continue to improve. It felt like I was tied to a heavy ball and chain for the rest of my life. This is when the quiet whispers of doubt, sadness, and loss of interest in many of my aspects of life took a negative turn. Loss provokes grief, and grief is very complex and deeply personal to the one experiencing grief. I was in this tornado of emotions that I could not get a grasp of, even with all my professional knowledge, my self-awareness, and my ability to reach out for help from family and friends. This was something I had to confront, but I didn't always have the cognitive ability or energy to do so. I was struggling to define what my new normal was. Do I give up hope? Will I regain more of my physical or cognitive abilities? Or should I try to be satisfied with what I had left? This was when I became reclusive, uninterested in engaging with others, or became tired of faking an upbeat persona. I perceived people looking differently at me, judging me, fearful of contracting COVID and becoming just like me. This was the elephant in the room for me. A lot of my family and friends could not handle my grief. I couldn't handle my grief. I found that individuals tried to normalize my cognitive and physical limitations by suggesting it was an age thing. This was not helpful. In fact, it was more damaging. I wanted to share my story, the process of my mourning that Leonard addressed in his presentation, an expression of grief, share my fears, and share my concerns. What I wanted to share was not heard and made some people uncomfortable. This portion of my journey is what I like to refer to as cleaning out the weeds in my support garden. This is where I discovered who was strong enough to walk with me through my journey of grief, who could hear my story, hear my self-doubts, and gently support me or just listen. Just listen without judgment or needing to give me advice. And this is when I discovered who could not walk with me, and maybe they never could, but my chronic illness brought this to light. It was when the tears spontaneously erupted one day, numerous times in the day, uncontrollable tears. For a couple of weeks, I knew I was in trouble. Avoidance of grief can lead to places of despair and hopelessness. This is when I realized I needed outside help. I contacted my family physician and shared with her my experience. I knew I was depressed. This was a new experience for me, total loss of emotional regulation. As a professional, I would discuss with clients how medication can help us through a tough time. But for me, it brought on shame and despair. I was a professional. I could handle this. I have the training. I did the self-diagnosis and I was correct. So why could I not get through this on my own? I also encourage my clients to seek a professional in conjunction with taking medication. That was my next step. I was grateful for my psychologist. I can't tell you how supported I felt, how heard I felt, how safe I felt sharing my deepest, darkest thoughts about the chronic illness I now had. I was treated for PTSD, anxiety, depression, and I was grieving for the old me. Interesting enough, as time passed, I didn't see these as negative labels. Rather, it was encouraging for me to acknowledge that I wasn't mad or losing my mind. And with introducing some practical strategies, reminding me of strategies I encouraged my clients with chronic pain to explore, I regained hope.